Welcome, everybody, and welcome to the third technical meeting organized by the AACE International Australian section. My name is Fran Vera. I am the events coordinator, and I'll be the host for the session tonight. And today's webinar is about documenting the scheduled basis, the recommended practice number 38. Before getting started, let me introduce Louis Vidotto. He is the current Vice President of the AACE Australian section and also the Area Chair of Queensland. He will run a few slides about the association, and also he'll introduce us the speaker for tonight.
Good evening, everyone. I guess you can hear me. Welcome to this March 2021 technical meeting. I'm very happy that everyone's here. So I'll start my introduction. Bit of an agenda. I'm going to go through the meeting procedures first and explain those. Then I'll do a bit of an introduction to AACE International and the AACE Australian section. And then we now have a bit of a tradition that we pick something related to the AACE International website. So tonight I thought I would just revisit total cost management and just reinforce the importance and the benefit of that document. So I'll talk about that a little bit later. Tonight's webinar is do you have the right ingredients in your contract or baseline schedule? So we had a bit of a dry run during the week on this seminar, and it's really pertinent to the way that we're doing schedules at the moment on our contracts and our projects. And Alberto Sanchez, who's our presenter, will go through it in due course. At the end, we'll have some final questions to the speaker. And Frank will coordinate questions. So please use your chat section to ask questions, and then Frank will arrange those to Alberto for answering. And then at the end of the session, we'll have an open mic session. So everybody's welcome to stay back and talk about the webinar or anything that's of interest to you as a project controls or project management professional. So meeting procedures. Attendees will be muted during presentations, and that's why you need to use your chat to ask questions. You will have an opportunity to interact at key points in the presentation, and certainly Alberto will say, okay, let's have a bit of a break here and we'll ask some questions and address those as we go through. So again, if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, please use the meeting chat feature. Also, too, we'll make this webinar available on the AACE Australian section YouTube channel after the session, so you'll be able to access it and rerun it and digest the fantastic information again. And the slideshow will be published on the AACE Australian section website. If you would like a certificate of attendance, please email info@AACE Australia. Thank you. So a little bit about AACE. AACE stands for the Association for the Advancement of Cost Engineering, and it's been serving the total cost management community since 1956. I've been a member now for probably 10 or 15 years, and I've found it very useful for information and also engagement with other people within our community. AACE is committed to the constructive exchange of ideas between members. So webinars like this that we're presenting are a fantastic way to interact with our section and with other members within our section, and certainly with other members in other parts of AACE. Development of technical guidance and quality education. Our recommended practices are fantastic, as well as the total cost management framework. and also to recognition of subject matter experts. There's a lot of experts in our profession who are part of AACE who certainly make themselves available to answer questions from time to time, and certainly provide opinion on things that they think they can provide opinion on. Okay, so AACE, Australia Board, we've recently had elections, and you'll see that we're fairly representative around Australia. Certainly, New South Wales is where a lot of our members, of the committee members are. And myself, I'm based in Queensland, and then we have some people. We also would love to get some people involved out of South Australia, and certainly Northern Territory. At the moment, Alan Crowe, who's representing West Australia, is also taking on that role to look after NT. But certainly, if you're a member of AACE and you come from those states and you'd like to get involved from those states, you're more than welcome. So each month, I would like to draw your attention to a part of the AACE website. Tonight, I thought I'd just revisit our framework document for AACE, Total Cost Management. So what is total cost management? It's an integrated approach to project, program, and portfolio management. Total cost management is a systematic approach to managing costs through the life cycle of any enterprise or program or facility or project or product or service. An integrated project approach to portfolio program project management is structured, annotated process, and it also explains each area of the cost engineering field in context of a relationship to other practitioners, including allied professionals. If as a member of AACE, I strongly recommend that you get it or certainly read it. Tonight, in particular, I'd like to focus a little bit on cost engineering. So AACE's International Recommended Practice 88 talks about the required skills and knowledge of cost engineering and provides some answers which are excerpted here. Beyond being a guiding document for AACE International Education and Certification, it's an excellent reference for industry core competency and career model development. So cost engineering, it's more than cost control. It's being able to estimate, being able to provide business plan, it's being able to provide profitability analysis and project management. And one of the key areas of cost engineering is being able to forecast. Certainly in my career, the main thrust of being a cost engineer is knowing where a project or certainly a project or anything like that is at, and being able to say, okay, this is where we are on the journey, where are we going to be when we finish? And I think projects, businesses, any sort of project really relies on that information. We've got a budget of X dollars, but how much is that project going to really cost us? So certainly, I recommend that people read required skills and knowledge of cost engineering, and I think it's quite a valuable document. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Alberto Sanchez to present tonight's webinar, which is, do you have the right ingredients in your contract or baseline schedule? I'll let Alberto introduce himself, give a bit of background, and then I'll let him proceed with the webinar. And as I said, he'll probably pause sometime through for questions, and Frank will be the moderator and make sure that the questions get asked.
Okay.
So again, just a very, very quick presentation will discuss the importance of the basis of schedule for contract and project schedules, what should be included, and how well is the construction industry documenting that document. So I'll hand over the presentation now to Alberto. Thank you.
Thank you, Lloyd. Well, thank you, Luis, for the introduction and about the AACE. So tonight, as you mentioned, we're going to be talking about, do you have the right ingredients in your contract or baseline? And the idea of tonight is really just to go through one of our recommended practice, the 38R-06. So this is one of the recommended practice that I use more often. So there are 82 recommended practice that have been reviewed, developed, and updated by the association for many, many years. And more recently, the AACE have been breaking down some of the recommended practice into different sectors. So now you can see some recommended practice more into the road, highways, industrial, process industry, building, and commercial, which is quite good. So you can be more focused on the specific sector that you are working for. So a little bit of background. So my name is Alberto. I have been working in planning and project control for now 28 years. I have been working in Europe, in Australia, in Asia, Middle East. And I have been very lucky to be working with people with a lot of experience in planning and project control in my career. Recently, I have been in Australia for the last 4 years, working for a large construction company. And I'm then the chairman of AACE New South Wales. So I have been a member of AACE now for 20 years. So I'm a regular user of all the recommended practice, and it's something I have been using during all my career. So then let's go to the agenda for tonight. So talk about a little bit about the overview, the background of documenting the schedule basis. What is the purpose of this recommended practice? What is the contract schedule? Something that I decide to put at the end in the presentation is the degree of project definition, because this is going to be, a direct link to the amount of assumption that you need to make and document in your basis of the schedule. The difference between the planning and the scheduling process, and then we will go through the goals and ingredients. And when we talk about ingredients, it's really just to break down, the recommended practice and just to go through all the different elements that we have in this practice. Then talking about the scheduling techniques and software. And then the last point, I'm not going to talk much about this, but it's just the required skills and knowledge. So similar to the recommended practice that Louis mentioned about cost engineering, that is another recommended practice. And that is basically just for planning and scheduling. So a little bit of overview. So, people ask the question about why should the basis of the schedule be documented, and what is really the goals to achieve by documenting the schedule basis, and what content should the schedule basis be included, and what is the implication of incomplete or poor schedule basis. And then, I was asking this question to a few colleagues, and we have a project control night last week, and I was asking people about how well do you think that we're documenting, the schedule basis in the industry. And I know I was quite amazed that most people think that, we're really good in documenting the base of the cost estimate, but not really good in documenting the schedule basis. So then I decided to post, a survey in one of the social media, and I got, pretty good input from almost 100 people. And what you can see here is just that, 43% of the people taking the survey think that, that's actually going to be very poor. So, and we're not really documenting the basis of the schedule in the right way, and people say fair, and it's only like 19% think that is good. Obviously, it depends a little bit of the industry. So I'm trying to understand more who was behind the survey. And some people that they say that is good, they are coming more from the mining and resources sector. And then people say it's poor or fair, is basically a different sort of industry. But it really give me a good view of what we need to do maybe as a planning community to ensure that we actually improve the standards that we have in planning and project control. So again, when you talk to construction companies, they always tell you that the two of the more important documents for them is the cost estimate and the contract schedule. and it's basically just the basis for them just to put a proposal. And then we see that it's common practice for companies just to document the basis of the cost estimate. As I mentioned before, it's either for review and approval through the process of the project. But and they also using this as a reference for change management. But unfortunately, the companies put less effort, or they are less interested in requesting the basis of the schedule. I was talking to 2-3 government agencies, last week in this project control event, and they were talking about, that's something, we need to start to think more about, what sort of information we request to the contractors about, what is the basis of the schedule, because sometimes we're not really understand, what is actually just behind the baseline. Then we always talk in the planning community about the limited opportunities for planners to interface with everybody in the project team. So there is always a hurry just to develop whether it's a bid schedule or the baseline or the contract schedule, and sometimes the person who is putting the schedule, they just need to get information from different people and just put it in a master schedule, but don't have the time really just to sit with everybody to understand the strategy and really understand all the detail. And we understand that the preparation of the schedule and the schedule basis is quite challenging and time consuming for the project planners. And again, if you are working in a proposal, you only start to get all the information to prepare the schedule in the last few weeks before you actually need to go to the reviews, before you can actually close the bid to go to the client. But the problem really is that a lack of understanding of the schedule basis can result in confusion among parties, or disagreement, loss of productivities, rework, delays, and sometimes we end up with claims and disputes. So again, what is the purpose of the webinar tonight? Is really just to provide an overview of the AACE International recommended practice, that is the documenting the schedule basis. So I guess if you are a regular user of the recommended practice like me, you probably found that this document is actually very, very useful. These recommended practice have assisted many companies for several years in the development of the specification. So I have been working in projects where the client actually make reference to this recommended practice. So they say, look, your schedule basis need to be in compliance with AACE 38R-06. And I have seen this more and more often in some clients, that I worked before in overseas. So again, the focus of this recommended practice is to document all the elements that have been used to develop the schedule, and provide really a clear understanding of the contract baseline and the schedule. So what is the contract schedule? So the contract schedule represents how the project will be built, and include the approved scope of work as agreed between the parties at the time of signing the contract. And we will have to keep this in mind when we go through the presentation, that it really just is the approved scope of work as agreed, and it's really just how we're going to build the project, how we're going to deliver the project. Okay. Now, before we jump into the different elements that we have in the basis of the schedule, I think that there are key points that we need to address. The first one is the degree of project definition. It really defines the maturity and the type of input information available to develop the contract schedule. So if you are developing the schedule when it's still in the early stage of the design, or the design is not complete, or the design is not a good quality, this is going to impact the maturity of the input that you use for your schedule. And then it means that you probably need to make a lot of assumptions, or you need to make sure that there is a lot of work that you need to exclude because it's not sufficient definition. Then we had the difference between the project planning and scheduling. So again, there is a lot of people that use planning and scheduling, as in the same process, which is not. They are two entirely different processes. So we need to understand and document all the planning process, because that's really the backbone for the developing of the schedule. And we will go through detail in this in the presentation. And then the last key point to highlight is the different skills and knowledge that we need. So again, because planning and scheduling a different process, it really demands different skill and knowledge. So the person working in the planning phase, it may not be the same person doing the scheduling. And if that is, you need to be sure that you actually understand the planning and the scheduling process. And also depending on the current phase of the project life cycle. So if you need to develop the schedule when you are just in the feasibility study phase, when you have limited information, the person who is developing the schedule need to have probably just a different skills, because you need to use a lot of previous knowledge, historical data, benchmark. When if you need to develop the schedule when you are already moving into the construction phase, or you have a lot of information already about the project scope. So if we start with the degree of project definition, there is actually a really good recommended practice again in the AACE that is about the schedule classification system. So you can see here is the different schedule class. So if we go from a class 5 to a class 1, so again, if you need to develop a schedule class 5, which is when you have a degree of project definition of, let me just use my pointer here. If you have a degree of project definition, which is basically just 0 to 2%, and we will talk in the next slide about what is the meaning of project definition. So you are really just looking at a concept screening. So it's market studies. It's really just to, well, do you want to build a pharmaceutical facility? It's going to be in Dubai or it's going to be in Saudi. So I have been involved in this sort of, very early stage where it's basically just, very, very high level plan, few summary bars, and then few major milestones with approvals, contract award, and when you need to have a commissioning. And because you don't really have a good definition of the project scope, the level of accuracy is not really the best. So that's when you need to have, a very good basis of the schedule in this case, because you need to explain to people, well, look, this schedule is based on a very high level assessment of the project. We haven't decided yet the location of the asset. So it's this sort of thing that you need to document in your basis. When, if you're already just in a class 2 where you are a contractor, you are invited to bid for a DNC or an EPC contract, you already have a 30 to 75% degree of project definition. So you actually have, a better definition with the project plans, with the drawings, and so the level of assumption is probably going to be less than the level of assumption that you need to do when you're doing a feasibility study. And then when you see here the scheduling methods, that when you start to talk more about bottom-up planning, it's a detailed planning. You start to look at detailed resource loading, logical driven, where the other schedule class is probably just a more high level. So I found this document really, really good. I have seen some clients, again, that they make reference to the schedule classification system when they call a class 5 level 1, or they talk about class 2 level 4, because it's very clear in this recommended practice the level of detail that you need to have in your schedule. So when we talk about degree of project definition, and again, there is another recommended practice that is where you can see the input checklist and maturity matrix. So it's a big document, so I just decide just to put up, in a small section of the recommended practice, and that really just tells you, what sort of information you need, and the level of, maturity of the project deliverables when you start to develop the schedule. So you see, if we are doing a class 5, as we mentioned before, and you say, well, a site plan, yeah, you need to start a site plan, but then, construction permits that are not required. Okay, because you are really just doing a concept screening. So, but then, if you're moving into a class 3 or class 2, when you are the contractor and bidding for the job for a DNC or an EPC, you can see that, most of these critical items like the site plan, design specification, the line diagrams, the general equipment arrangement, plot plan, facility, they are all complete. And some of them, they're still in the, like a preliminary phase, but you already have a better definition of the project scope. So these recommended practice address not only the technical deliverables, but they also address all the commercial deliverables. So it's also talk about logistic plans and also talk about, all the constructability plans that you need to have, whether it's going to be on a preliminary phase or it's complete, to be sure that you have the right, level of definition to develop your schedule. I try to use this is just me personal, I'm trying to use this when I'm doing the schedule reviews, and to be sure whether there is something that we either need to qualify, or something that we need to make an assumption, or something that we need to exclude, or something that we need to consider in the contingency for the schedule. So then we go to the difference between project planning and scheduling. So, and I think, again, it is very important that we understand this, because the planning phase or the planning process is very critical to understand before we move to the scheduling process. So I try to put this in a graph where people can see it. So it's probably not going to be everything, but it's just trying to summarize some of the points that you need to address during the planning process. So you need to develop the project plan. You need to understand the project scope. You need to identify the stakeholders. You need to define the high-level strategy. You need to conduct the site surveys. You need to define the constructability, define the procurement strategy, the subcontracting strategy, and then you feed all these into your planning process. On the other side, you as a company probably have some policies and procedures. Let's say that, well, we have a policy in the company that we need to have minimum three bids for critical equipment. So you need to be sure that you allow sufficient time in the planning process to do these steps, and you use historical information just to be sure about, is this the sort of business that we are? Are we confident that we can deliver the project? And then, you need to have a look, well, is this project aligned with our business strategy, with our business plan? And then you get all the technical and legal support. So when you're doing all the planning process and you think that your planning strategy is already, what you expect, and you had your winning strategy for bidding the job, and all the different parties agree that, yeah, I think that we're happy with this, we should go ahead, with the next step. Then is when you translate the planning process into the scheduling process, and that's when you start to do. You need to review the stages. You need to identify the activities. So the scope, you need to translate the scope into activities and tasks. Now you understand the strategy, but you need to develop the activity logic. You need to estimate the duration. You need to allocate resources. You need to review the critical path, identify the key project dates, review the risk. So you start to do all the scheduling process. And after that, you're doing what I would call the project schedule reviews, where you're doing the schedule quality review or the integrity of the schedule. You're doing a schedule risk review, whether you're doing an SRA or you're doing a different, risk assessment methodology. And then you're doing a benchmark. So you want to say, well, how competitive is our schedule, and how these compare to, projects that we built in the past. And then when everybody's happy with the schedule, so then you document and communicate the contract schedule. So and when you say on the contract schedule. So I know that having this conversation before about the baseline schedule, whether you want to have multiple baseline. Have been talking to people about the use of internal baseline. They are like the Americans call it the GOES schedule that is used for early completion. Look, it's really just up to you. The contract schedule is only one. Your baseline schedule, there are some clients that they call the contract as a baseline. You probably have another baseline, whether you want to have a more aggressive completion date. it's really just, up to you. This is depending on the strategy that you use to deliver the project. So, and before I move to the next one, do we have any question?
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, Alberto, we have one question. What is in your experience, or what class of the degree of definition is known for a project approval? Normally, at which stage or at which class you get the project approval? It was, I think, in the degree of project definition.
Yeah, well, it depends on what you call the project approval. If you're talking about, getting the project sanction to start, to get a budget and to go ahead, I would say that you probably are between class 4 and class 3. So, and the class 5 is very, very high level. It's just a constant screening. So it's, just to give an example, I was involved in in one of the constant screening for a project in the Middle East, where the client said, well, I don't know if we want to build a process facility with 3 process train or 2 process train or 1 process train. We don't know if we want 2 process facilities or 1 big process facility. So it was really just to do a little bit of evaluation of the different options. And after the client decide, yeah, well, I want to go with a single facility, 3 process train, and we want to have our own utilities. So do you have sort of like an understanding of the what is going to be the project scope? Then you're doing a feasibility study that is basically just to move the project forward in the definition of the technical feasibility study. So at this point, you're really just looking at, well, you need to have a better definition. You're probably going to know with a schedule that they have a much better level of accuracy. And at this point, you actually ask for funding just to get to the next phase. And then when you get to the next phase, it's really just depending on the project delivery strategy by the client. They may decide to split, the feed separate from the EPC, or they probably decide to feed and detail engineering into one package. And that's really the point at the end of the class 3, where clients just look for the project sanction to get the full funding for the delivery of the project, which is basically the class 2 and the class 1. And at this point, the client should already have the project approved or the project sanction with all the full funding to go ahead for the delivery. So I hope it answered your question.
Thank you. Definitely, Alberto. There's another very interesting question made by Arsalan. He's asking do you believe both schedulers and planners must have a certain level of technical knowledge relevant to the project scope?
Well, that's ideal. So ideally, you have a planner that they really understand, the strategy, and there's somebody that can challenge, the construction team or the design team about the feasibility and how realistic the schedule is. Unfortunately, we have seen more and more in the industry where, the planning team, is really just coming with something and just giving to a scheduler, and the scheduler is basically just somebody that understands how to use the tool. So yeah, but ideally you have these sort of skills where, the person who developed the schedule is the person who actually get involved also during the planning process. And it doesn't mean that the person who developed the schedule need to know everything, but at least should have some kind of technical background and to be involved through all the journey to develop the planning strategy.
Yeah. The next question is more related to one of the slides that you are going to show us later on. So I think we should move on.
Okay. Let me just go back again. Just give me a second. Okay, so now we are in the schedule basis. So what are we trying to achieve with documenting the basis of the schedule? So, and first is we're trying to identify all the key elements, issues, assumptions that we use to develop the schedule. Then to provide a better understanding of what is or not included in the contract schedule. Then to provide a record of all documents used to prepare the schedule. So if we look again at the table that we had before, where we see all the list of documents here. So ideally, during in the base of the schedule, you make reference to the document that you use to develop the schedule, because it really gives you a really good understanding about how well defined was the scope by the time that you develop the project schedule. Then you also use the basis of the schedule to provide comparison to benchmarking, whether it's internal or external benchmarking, and you use this to validate the schedule. So you sometimes either for productivity rates, and you say, well, I use this productivity rate for my contract schedule, whether it was, I don't know, let's say 4 piles per day, or 100 cubic meters of concrete per day, or whatever, and how this compare with historical projects. So or you can do this at a high level and say, well, look at, we build this, let's say, an ethylene plant, and it took 42 months, with 3 heaters. So now we're going to do the same. And, are we in the same range? And there is a lot of, historical data benchmark, not only internal, but you have a lot of organization that actually provide this sort of, external benchmark. Then to inform the project team about the potential risk and opportunities. So it's very important that we identify the risk, opportunities, issues, and concerns that we have at the time that we develop the schedule. Then it's established at the baseline for change management. What it means is, well, look at if there is something that we change in the strategy, or there is something that was changed on the, let's say, on the key project date, or there is something in the path of execution they have changed, you need to go back and, well, do you need to re-baseline the project, because now this is not, what we originally intend to do, and we can do a reconciliation analysis through the project life cycle. And finally, for me, the schedule basis is really just help to review and validate the schedule, to have whoever is the person responsible to review and validate the schedule. So if we go to the ingredients or the different components that you have in the recommended practice. So this is basically what you see in the AACE recommended practice for the schedule basis. So you have all these different sections in the recommended practice. You may find that not all of them may be applicable depending on the project phase that you are. So if you are doing a class 5 or class 4 schedule where you're doing concept screening, you probably have something like a punch list, turnover, system startup, that you don't really need to address this at this point, because it's a very, very high level. But then, when you start to move into a better definition of the project, you probably need to start to look at, trying to cover all these elements in the schedule basis before you get into the delivery. So if we start with, the first one, the project description. So the project description in the schedule basis is really just a very high level introduction and description of the project. So let's say, well, look at, the project is the construction of a new stadium. The existing stadium will be demolished. It doesn't meet the standard for international games. So very high level. The phase of the project should be also included in this section. So, right at the beginning of the schedule basis, so people understand the degree of project definition. Again, as we mentioned before. So if we say the client is looking for a DNC or design and construct contractor to complete the design and to build a new stadium, already come to your mind that if you're talking about a DNC contract, that you should have some level of definition in the design. And if you are not, so that's the kind of thing that you need to address in the schedule basis, whether it's you need to assume something, or you need to qualify, or you need to exclude something, or you think that it's going to be a risk that you need to allow for something in your contingency. And then something that you need to keep in mind is the schedule basis should be updated as the project progresses through the project phases. So again, if we're talking about class 5 or class 4 schedule, very early stage. So there are some element in the schedule basis that you don't have the information, but when you start to progress, you probably start to revisit your schedule basis because you need to start to put more information to understand how you're going to deliver the project. So then we had the scope of work. So the scope of work is basically just, the section where, you have, a high level, the work breakdown structure and the OBS, or the organizational breakdown structure. So you need to identify very clear about who is responsible for that. So if we go back again to the new stadium, which was one of the business case that we present during an SRA in one of the webinars. So you say, well, the project is broken down into the early works. You have utility relocation. We are not doing this. This is by others. And the demolition of the site is by others. The site establishment, we have the piling, we have the steel structure in the roof, the internal and external work. So you have, graphically, a high level understanding of the project scope. Then we move again, at the execution strategy. And this section describes the execution approach. So first, define the contract type. So are we doing the schedule for fixed price, single stage, or we're talking about 2 stages contract, or we're talking about construct only? So why is important to understand the sort of contract type? Because if we talk about the 2 stages contract, so we know that, the schedule is basically just for the completion of design and the planning phase. And then it's going to be a period of review and approval before we move into the second stage, that is going to be the completion of detailed design, procurement, and construction. If the contract is just a construct only, so you would expect that, the design is already complete. So, and that's one of the assumptions. If it's not, so you need to be sure in your assumption or in your exclusion that, that we shouldn't actually accept any change orders in the design unless we get a time and cost compensation. So then we talk about the subcontracting strategies, how you intend to deliver the project. Is it going to be a separate form? Are we going to do everything with our own people, our own construction equipment? Are we going to have multiple subcontractors, or this project is actually just delivered in a joint venture with another contractor or another company? The procurement strategy as well, whether we have single source for some of the critical equipment, or you probably have clients that they define very clear about what is the supply that they want to use for some kind of instrument and control, or you have clients in the mining and resources where they say we only use this type of compressors, and we always use the same because we have global agreements. So you need to identify this sort of single source equipment, because you actually have a different procurement cycle. And they propose suppliers, and then we talk about local versus overseas suppliers. So we talk about a project with a high local content, which means that, but if there is not a local capability, we need to split the procurement into multiple local suppliers. Or we talk about overseas. If it's overseas, you need to be sure that you have sufficient time in the supply chain for the testing, packing, transportation, custom clearance, and delivery to the site. So again, it gives you just a very high level understanding of the execution strategy. The constructability, are we talking about standard construction? Are we talking about modular? Are we talking about off-site, semi-modular construction? And the recommended practice in AACE also talk about the cash flow profile. I don't know, it's really just up to you if you think that this should be included in this section, but it really addresses the availability of funding. You sometimes have projects where the client has some kind of restriction about the amount of work that you can do per year based on the cash flow expenditure plan that they have. So sometimes you have clients say, the first year of the project, you shouldn't exceed more than 20% of the cash flow or 20% of the budget. So then you need to address this, because your procurement strategy may be driven by the availability of funding. Then we had the key project date. So this section describes the key milestones that we have in the schedule. So we're talking about contract awards, we're talking about access date, we're talking about whether we have separate portions, Do you have any milestone that is going to carry some, ALDs or penalties, regulatory key dates? Well, if you're doing a project that you need to have some shutdowns for the existing facility, interface date, hold point. And what you will see that the key date provide high level information to the client, to the senior executive, general managers, and they probably going to look at the key project date, when they move to delivery, to see, any variance between the contract date and the actual date. So do we have any question here so far, Frank?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
There's Rohit asking about the frequency of updating this document. Is it something that we should do it only one time at the beginning of the project when you want to get your schedule approved, or is just something that you should do it regularly as you update the schedule?
Okay. It depends if you are the client or you're the contractor. If you are the client, you should update the basis of the schedule on a regular basis when you progress your project from one project phase to another phase. So if you move from feasibility or concept screening to feasibility to design to then going into delivery, you should update your base of the schedule. If you are the contractor, I would say that this is the document that you need to revisit if there is a fundamental change in your either strategy or you have a change on some of the contract dates. And you will see there is a section in the recommended practice that is called baseline changes. Okay. And then when we talk about this, you will see that if there is something that is impacting either your critical path or some of the risk and opportunities, you probably need to revisit, to document. This is not a document that you're going to produce and it's going to be in a draft, for 2-3 years until you finish the project. So it's really just to people to communicate if there is any change on the schedule, on the way that you're going to deliver the project. You should update the base of the schedule, because whoever is going to review and validate the re-baseline need to be sure about what are the bases of the re-baseline.
Okay. And then another question related to the stakeholders. Where do you include them? In which part of the schedule basis do you include the stakeholders?
Well, I would say that when you're doing the project description and the scope of work, during the project description, you probably need to talk more about the stakeholders, the internal, but also the external stakeholders that you have. And then another section is here when we talk about the OBS, the organization breakdown structure. So in this section, if you have something like, well, look, we have a stakeholder with Sydney Water or Energy Australia because we need to do relocation of utilities or we need to do a connection to existing assets, you probably need to highlight this here to ensure that you have, all these addressed. There is a good document in the AACE that is called a stakeholder matrix or stakeholder coordination matrix. And you will see that some people actually develop this stakeholder matrix and they attach these to the schedule basis as just like an attachment. The same way that you attach your critical path and your schedule, they attach the stakeholder matrix, which is a pretty good document because the document not only address the stakeholder and the scope, but they also address the level of, how can I say, the level of influence in the project success, which is quite important sometimes. So you probably have a stakeholder that their scope of the approval is very minimum from the scope point of view, but they have a big influence in delivering the project on time. So this document in the AACE talk about the project scope, the split of the responsibilities, but also the level of influence to the project success. Any other question, Frank?
Yeah, we have a couple of more questions, but I think we should keep moving. Maybe at the end we can tackle them.
Okay. So then after we address the key project date, the next one is the planning basis. So it's really just to describe the methodology and the sources that we use to develop the contract schedules. So we talk about, how you estimate the activity duration. So we talk about market validation. So we actually talk to subcontractors and say, well, we have the drawings, we have the quantities, how long do you think that it's going to take to build this, this section of the project? Or, or we use historical projects. So we say, well, we have historical data that is say, well, what is the productivity rate? And you also talk about, the project calendars, whether calendar, shutdown calendar, do we need to do something during a shutdown, or we need to do this project during a rail possession. You also talk about the site facilities, storage, laydown, logistics. Are we talking about this project in a place that is densely populated area? What is the distance to the laydown areas, traffic routes? We talk about the sources of the planning productivity rate. So are we getting productivity rates from similar projects, or are we getting it from the subcontractors? The resource planning, and we're talking about, what is the crew size, the mix. We're talking about 80% local, 20%, coming from overseas or coming in interstate, and the basis for any subcontractor schedule. So if we have a section in our master schedule that is coming directly from one of the subcontractors, let's say that you have a subcontractor that is responsible for the design, supply, and install of the, let's say, a water treatment package. So you need to understand from the subcontractor, what did you include, what did you exclude, what are the basis of your subcontractor schedule? Are you expecting to get, permanent power from our side, so you can actually pre-commission your package? So it's really to understand all the basis of the subcontractor schedule and how all they fit into the master schedule. Then we look at the critical path. So again, I put a note here about the 39R-06. So it's a very good recommended practice that is called identifying the critical path. And it really addresses everything about critical path, near critical path. And it has some very good point about legal interpretation of longest path and critical path. So again, this section is really just to inform the project parties about the critical path or critical path and the near critical path of the project. It should provide enough detail to the project parties to focus on the areas that it could affect the completion of the project on time. Again, you need to attach your critical path and your near critical path, where your schedule basis for review and validation of the schedule. And look, a point here that is really that we need to ensure that we have a very clear understanding about the legal interpretation of the longest path, critical path, float ownership. And there is always a lot of arguments about who owns the float. Is the client, is the contractor? And so that is important that then, any kind of, definition of legal definition or commercial definition about the critical path of float ownership that is in the contract or in the tender document is actually just highlight in this section of the schedule basis. So everybody understand about, the definition of the critical path and float. Then we had the path of execution. So it's really just to talk overall about the sequencing. Do you have different project stages? The project is broken down into stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, or the project phases. Is the client expecting to have different separate portion or different completion dates depending on the stage? And then, you put in a high level. So you see sometimes in a schedule basis that, you have some schematics that you can see, well, this is stage 1 is in this color, stage 2 is in this color, stage 3 is in this color. And it's probably had to be aligned with the key project date and the execution strategy. I put a note here about 4D planning, but we will address this in one of the sections. But it's also important to understand if there is any requirement for 4D planning. So if you need to develop your schedule and the project phases to show to the client in the 4D planning, you need to be sure that you have the right level of definition in your schedule to be aligned with the 4D planning and sufficient detail in the 3D model to define your 4D planning strategy. Then the next section, and people think that this is more related to projects in the industry and process sector, oil and gas, mining, or petrochemical. But the reality is that it really applies for any sort of project, whether you're talking about infrastructure, or you're talking about tunneling, or you're talking about residential or commercial. You always going to have, a number of activities that you need for commissioning the asset. So in this section, you need to address any punch lists, turnover, commissioning, and startup activities. These activities usually involve a lengthy and very difficult process. Sometimes you have third parties, independent agencies, the fire brigade, they need to come to the building to witness any fire tests, or you have independent review for pressure tests for piping, or you have a storage tank, or you need to get one of the utility authorities to be present to do an electrical test to energize the substation before you connect to the grid. So there is a lot of work that you shouldn't underestimate, especially because most of this work is happening just right at the back end of the schedule. So if you have any delay, doing all the pre-commission and commissioning, you don't have more flow or contingency in the schedule to mitigate the delays. So in this section, you also need to describe the coordination with other stakeholders. So this is another section you probably need to address stakeholders. So if you have, let's say, you need to do a connection to an existing power or water asset, so you need to address, one of my stakeholders is going to be AusGrid or Energy Australia, or one of my stakeholders is going to be Sydney Water, because I need to connect, my asset to an existing water supply. Or, I'm building a new, let's say, petrochemical plant, and I need to connect this to the existing national grid. So you probably also need to address all the stakeholders, especially when you have local authorities and you have, utility authorities. You need to address this in this section, and you will be surprised about how many projects get delayed because approved by local authorities and relocation of utilities, and especially if you need to do this and at the beginning of the project you need to relocate utilities before you can get access to the site. So don't underestimate the time for all these activities. And any question, Frank, before I move to the next?
Maybe we can tackle the question that Nirav is asking. Is it a good practice to include the software or any tool that you have used in the basis of the schedule?
Yes, there is one section that we will address this.
Okay, cool. And I think we can also answer another question. Can we say that the schedule inherits a major portion from the contract type? For example, the strategy of drafting a schedule while we are under the NEC4 contract is very different from other type of contract. Yeah, can we say that the schedule inherits information or basis from the contract type, or what is the relationship among them?
Well, it is, and obviously your execution strategy is driven by the type of contract. So just to give an example, if you are in a project that is an EPCM, where basically you're going to do all the procurement and the subcontracting in behalf of the client, the client may have a different procurement process that you need to follow. So and they probably say, well, you need to have minimum 3 bidders for, let's say, for the site preparation package, and they probably say, well, we need minimum 4 weeks just to do commercial reviews. And you inherit all these sort of process and policies from the client because you are managing the project in behalf of the client. And if this is an EPC and it's a lump sum or a fixed price or D&C, it's really just up to the contractor to decide how to do the procurement. So you may have already an strategic alliance with a structural steel supplier, so you don't need to go through the procurement process because you always use the same supplier. Whether you are in an EPCM, even though you have a strategic alliance with one of the supplier, the client is going to ask for a transparent or to have an open procurement process. So it is different. If you have a 2 stages contract, again, clients are moving more and more into two stages contract because they know that they don't have a full definition of the design, so they're expecting the contractor just to complete the design and complete all the planning process. So at this point, you need to make a lot of assumptions for the schedule that you develop for the stage 2. So again, it all depends on the contract type. It's going to have a different on the strategy and the execution strategy. Yeah.
Okay. We have some more questions, but I think we are running out of time, and I'm going to put them at the end.
Okay. Yep. So then the next section is about issues and concerns. So you describe, concern during the development of the contract schedule. So the different, people think about sometimes we talk about risk, or well, it depends on how you address this. So the purpose of this section is to identify, any concern that you had that you couldn't resolve, before the approval of the contract schedule. I really advise that you have an issue and concern log, so you identify all the open and closed items. So if you're developing the schedule during the proposal stage or the bid stage, or you say, well, the land acquisition is not clear whether it's going to be available or not, we put this as a concern. Or incomplete design, well, it's supposed that we had to complete the design during the proposal stage. We didn't have time to resolve, the design in this section of the project. It's a concern. We had to make some assumptions because we're running out of time and we need to prepare the contract schedule. Or unresolved constructability areas that you are not, you are not fully in agreement on, how you're going to deliver a section of the project. So again, you just highlight this as one of the concerns that you need to resolve. And at some point, or whether you have incomplete design, not having the bill of quantities. So, and because this is going to be something that when you read this in the base of the schedule, the first question is, have you identified this in your assumptions? So what is assumption? Or are we going to exclude this because we have an incomplete design? Or we highlight this as a risk, so it means that we have some contingency in the schedule. So it's really just the first step or to open the gate to how you're going to manage this as a risk, as assumption, exclusion. So then we talk about the risk and opportunities. So this section describes the potential risk that may occur during the execution of the project. So recommendation from the AACE is that you actually run a quantitative risk assessment. Obviously, it depends on the project phase. So trying to do a quantitative, risk analysis for a class 5, schedule, is not, you're not going to get what you expect because you don't have, full definition of the project scope. But, it's ideal that you complete an SRA, before, you actually, finalize your baseline schedule. The project team, can actually assess whether it's an optimistic, it's most likely, or some pessimistic duration in your baseline schedule, and what sort of contingency. I like to see the probability to meet the key date. So we're talking about P50, we're talking about P75, or what sort of contingency we have in the contract milestone. And then in this section, we also need to explain how we're going to address some of the risk. So if we have a risk, let's say about contaminated material, well, don't worry because we're going to qualify this. So it means that any impact from unforeseen ground condition or contaminated material, our proposal say that we're going to get time and cost compensation. Or look, if we have any issues with, let's say, with some kind of artifacts that we find on site when we're doing the site preparation, we allow 20 days contingency in the schedule. So we really need to to understand how the commercial team is going to address some of these risks. Then we go to assumptions. So again, this is a section that when you move from the class 5 to a class 3 or class 2, you would expect the number of assumptions to reduce. For example, if you're doing the project schedule for, let's say for a government agency, or you have a 2 stages contract where the 2 stages contract is also driven by cash flow, you may draw an assumption here and say, well, my schedule for stage 1 is based on no cash flow constraint. And the client may agree or disagree, and they say, no, we have a constraint. So it means that some of the critical procurement package that we were planning to to order, in the stage 1, it had to be pushed to a stage 2. So that's the sort of assumption that you need to make it very clear for people to understand. Like, well, the assumption is that we're not going to be working in public holidays, or we're making an assumption that the labor will be available to deliver the project. So then, is for the person who is going to review the schedule may agree or disagree. So I have been in projects, in places like in Central Asia where making this sort of assumption is not really the best way to do it. You know that you need to import the workers. It takes some time to go through all the medical checks. You need to build the campsite. You need to do all the training. And it's probably going to take maybe like a 3 or 4 months before you actually have labor on site to start to do the work. You may also make an assumption that all the required permits are available and they have been already complete by the client. You make an assumption, or you can explain to the client, my schedule is on the basis that all the land acquisition is already complete. Let's say that you are building a new highway and you say, well, I'm expecting to get full access to all the corridor for me to start the work. So I'm not expecting to have any restriction or constraint about the sections that we can access to start to build the highway. Special construction equipment will be available. So let's say, well, we need to have any special equipment like a special barge for any marine work. The assumption is that it's going to be available. The site will be ready available after contract award. So that's something you put as an assumption in front of the client and say, we're expecting that, the contract award, and the next day we can move to the site to establish the site office, temporary facilities, and to do all the site surveys. And if the client say no, so then you have to see what is the impact in your baseline schedule, or something like the power will be available to start construction. So my recommendation is that when you're doing all these assumptions, you review this with your commercial and legal department or your commercial legal team to be sure that if you have any qualification is actually just aligned with the assumption that you have in the schedule. Then we talk about exclusions. So this section describes the items that they are not included or not considered in the contract or the baseline. So let's say we exclude sharing construction equipment. Okay, we exclude removal of contaminated material. We exclude the relocation of public utilities. We exclude the approval from heritage authorities, or we exclude, the installation of acoustic treatment, during the demolition of, the existing facility. So that's the sort of thing that you need to make clear. It is very important that this is aligned with the cost estimate basis, or the base of the cost estimate. If you say, well, we haven't allowed for the relocation of public utilities, it's important that, the cost estimate also is aligned and say, look, we may have an allowance here, but, it's not part of our price. And something that is just lesson learned. So if you have any exclusion and you submit this in your tender or in your bid, it's important that any change post-tender, in case of the client asks that you need to include these items. So they say, look, sorry, but you need to include in your schedule the relocation of public utilities. You need to be very sure that you go back again, review your schedule, and you update your basis of the schedule. Then it was one of the questions, Frank, about whether you need to update the basis of the schedule. Well, this section should be completed when the baseline has changed. Okay, and if you change, then you need to revisit, your base of the schedule. So that's what we call a rebaseline. So, and this is just whether you have more definition of the project scope, but it's also if you have a better understanding of, why the baseline schedule have changed, you need to capture this here. And it's really just a change from the original or the previous baseline schedule. So if you think that, let's say that you're working in a rail project, and you base your project on a number of rail possessions, and the client come back and say, sorry, but it have been some kind of reassessment of the rail, the track possession date, and now it's going to be 4 weeks later, or it's going to be a different track possession program. So obviously this is going to impact your baseline schedule, and you need to have a look again about what is the impact and how you're going to address this. So you need to explain, well, what are the action? Are we going to have, extra resources, or are we going to extend the schedule? Are we going to work overtime? Or it could be that you got a late possession of the site and the client say, yeah, we understand, we were 4 weeks late, but we want you to meet the date anyway. So you need to talk about, well, it's going to be some change in the execution strategy because some work is going to be in parallel or it's going to be concurrent. Or look, we didn't expect to be working, 6 days a week, and now we're going to be working 6 days a week until we catch up with the original baseline. So again, you need to address, this in this section. Then, we talk about the schedule reserve. This is, how it's written in the American version of the AACE. So that's what we probably call in Australia the contingency. So this section describes how the schedule reserve and contingency was estimated. So again, you need to have a look at the risk and opportunities that you highlight in your basis of the schedule. And then this section also provides assessment of the probability to meet the key date. And then you can express the contingency, in days, in percentage. And I would advise, and in this section, you just put a table, with all the key dates, and you say, well, this is the contract date, this is the scheduled date, or this is the, the baseline, and this is the contingency, or what is the probability to meet the contract date. So everybody understands really just, what is the contingency that you have built into the contract program or in the contract schedule. Okay. My preference is always to use an SRA, so you can assess the probability to meet the contract dates, and then you look at, well, what is the contract date is a P50 or that's a P70. There are some companies have some kind of internal requirements about any project more than $200 million. The project completion has to be a P50 or P75. Or your P value could be driven by how flexible is your contract for time compensation. And then the last point is what is called the project buy-in. So, and this is really just the section just to capture everybody that was involved in the preparation of the schedule. So again, the schedule basis and also the schedule is not the creation of just one individual. So it's not the project planner who develop everything. So and you have to work with project managers, with project engineering, with design managers, commercial managers, and there are many people involved in the development on the basis of the schedule. So that's why it had to be reviewed and approved by all the relevant members of the project team. So you need to be sure that everybody sign off, the basis of the schedule, so there is no disagreement. And then if you have any independent review in the company, whether you have a governance group, or you have a project assurance group that they had to do independent review of the schedule, so this group should also have a look at this and sign off so everybody understands the basis. So we talked about this before. If you have the incorrect information in the schedule basis, it may affect the resolution of dispute in the future. Just to give an example, the contract saying there is no time relief for inclement weather. So it means that your baseline schedule or your contract schedule should include sufficient delay contingency for inclement weather. Or you may have, the contract that say, well, you get time compensation, but you don't get cost compensation for inclement weather. So then you all these sort of things, they have to be very clear. So that's why you also need that, your base of the schedule is also reviewed and signed off by your commercial manager. So any question, Fran, before we move to the next?
Probably yes, we can address the question from John Boyle. He's asking about how frequent is as a contractor to issue a schedule basis from in the tender process. In the tender process,
okay. Hi, John. We're very good friends. And look, it really depends on time of, if we're talking about, an ECI, we're talking about early involvement of the contractor, we're talking about 2 stages, and we're talking about, whether the client is open to get interactive, sort of, planning workshop. We have been involved in infrastructure projects where you have planning workshop with the clients, where it's really good because you're making a lot of assumptions, you present the assumption to the client, and then the client projects, at that time during the interactive planning workshops, they give you more information. So you say, okay, now I got it. So I can remove this from the basis of the schedule. So maybe at that point that you are still in the interactive phase with the client, you may not have a formal document as a schedule basis, but when you present the schedule for one of these, planning workshop, you probably have, I don't know, whether you want to put in a PowerPoint or you want to do it in a different document where you say, well, the schedule that we have this point is based on this sort of assumption, exclusion, and this sort of risk. And maybe the client can give you more information. And then, when you submit your contract, where you have your basis of the schedule, and then, again, you need to update your basis of the schedule if there is a change on the execution strategy or a change on the date, or there is, the client decide to include something in the scope that it wasn't before. So that's when you go back to your baseline changes.
Okay. We have some other questions, but yeah, I think it's getting a bit late. And
okay. So
yeah,
let me just go quickly through this. Somebody was asking about the software. So the schedule basis should also have a section for techniques and software. So it should address about the software that the client has to use, whether they want to use on a specific planning tool or no different planning tool, and the techniques. So you have sometimes clients say, we don't want, or you are not allowed to use negative lags. You shouldn't have negative floats in the schedule. You are not allowed to use hard constraint. You need to have multiple calendars depending on on-site, off-site work. You need to do a resource loading. You have clients that they already ask for, you need to run a schedule quality analysis, a DCM 14, or they have some kind of requirement about 4D planning, and depending on the tool that they want to use. So yes, there is a section where you need to address all the techniques and the software. This section, I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I think that we should actually have a different webinar to talk about the skill and knowledge. So it's really just, the sort of a skill and knowledge that you need to have when you go from the project planning to develop the schedule to manage and control the schedule. So you can see that it's actually different kind of, skill and knowledge and, that you need to have. So, and you can see the difference between what you need if you're involved in the planning process or when you're involved in the scheduling process, or you're involved in the scheduling control. So again, this is a recommended practice, and maybe at some point we should have another webinar to talk about this. And then the conclusion, so the schedule basis must be clearly communicate to the technical basis, assumption, and strategy that we use to develop the contract schedule. The basis must be updated, John, as you mentioned before, as the project definition evolve throughout the life cycle of the project, or if there is any major change in the execution. And the schedule basis, it really helps the review and the validation of the schedule and the estimation of the risk and the schedule contingency. By documenting the schedule basis, company can improve the planning and the scheduling process because you can see all the processes you went through, and there is something you need to review. And the schedule basis is really just establish initial baseline for change management as the project move forward. And then one point that I had this conversation with people before in the association is that the schedule basis is not a one size fit all document. Again, it depends on the size of the project, depend on the end usage, and depend on the current phase of the project life cycle. And I just put here, some of the recommended practices that I think that they are relevant to this webinar. So that's the one that I use, the documenting the schedule basis. But we also talk about identifying the critical path, the responsibility and required skill for project planning and scheduling. The level of details, if somebody wants to read more about, level 1, level 2, level 3, or class 1, class 5, everything is addressed in this recommended practice. And all the process for the schedule development is just go step by step about how you need to develop the schedule and then how you document this in your basis. So any further question, Frank, that we have, or we want to open the mic? I don't know.
I think, yeah, we are exactly on time to move on to the open mic session. But before going, some final thoughts. Some of the questions were referring about the SRA, and we actually ran a webinar 2 months ago about the schedule risk analysis with Alberto as well. And you can go to our channel on YouTube and you can find more information over there. And our apologies because we couldn't address all the questions, but I'm planning to send the answers through an email along with the video recording in the following days.
And we had my Gmail, and there's also the AACE email. So if somebody have any questions, look, more than happy.
Yeah, actually, right now, if someone wants to speak and ask you directly any question, you are free to do so. Paul or Luis, do you have any final comments to move into the open mic?
Yes, certainly. Thank you very much, Alberto. It was very informative, and I hope everyone enjoyed the presentation. So I'll start off. One of the questions that Naresh asked, I think, was would you in a schedule include contingency as a one line or spread it through the activities? I've certainly got my view. I'm interested in yours.
Look, it also depends on the requirements. So I have been with clients where they say that you need to disclose the contingency in the schedule as a 1 bar a day, or you need to disclose the contingency as a bar, a day of every project milestone. And I have been with clients that say, it's up to you. I just want a contract schedule, and the contingency can be built into the schedule. So I wouldn't say that there is one rule for everything.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't think anyone is able to unmute themselves to start actually the open mic session. Paul, can you please first of all stop recording the session, because I think it's time to wrap up. Thank you everybody for attending. So and then Paul